For around 2 months, Iran has been rocked by nationwide protests. Sparked in mid-September by the murder of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old girl who had been beaten into a coma by Iran's morality police. She was targeted for wearing, quote, tight trousers and not applying her headscarf properly. Following her beating and subsequent death, protests erupted in her hometown of Saqqez and spread to roughly 80 cities around the country by the 22nd of September. Since then, at the time of writing on the 18th of October, protests have continued to grow in intensity, as have state efforts to crack down on dissent. These protests aim to challenge the existing system of theocratic Sharia law that mandates extreme restrictions on freedom of speech and expression for women in Iranian society, such as mandatory wearing of headscarves in public, the rule that Mahsa Amini had violated. But what are the origins of this opposition? Why has Iran, of all Middle Eastern countries that employ some version of Sharia law, been the focal point of opposition to said laws? The answer to understanding Iran's protests lies in its history, its time as an imperial state, its ultimate transition to theocracy, and the social ruptures that accompanied it, and how these come together to depict Iran as a state full of contradictions and conflicting values. Iran was for centuries a monarchy with a predominantly Muslim population, and by the 20th century, that reality had not changed. However, by 1905, the landscape had shifted somewhat. The demographic makeup of Iran had evolved. The middle classes in particular, whose size had burgeoned in the latter portions of the 19th century due to technological advancements and the explosion of global trade, had come under increasing exposure to the tenets of Western liberalism. Iran's defeat at the hands of Russia and Britain in numerous conflicts from 1813 to 1857 had caused her to concede some of her domestic economic sovereignty via unfavourable treaties, allowing the two European giants to extract resources from the territory without having to pay tariffs or import duties. As a byproduct of the increased influence of European imperial powers such as Britain and Russia in Iran, some started to reject the principles of religious autocracy and began embracing Enlightenment thinking and liberal ideas. Increasingly, nationalist sentiments also arose as the scale of foreign exploitation became clearer, with one merchant from Qazvin writing in 1890, "By what laws does the government sell our national rights to foreign racketeers? The Shah should call at once 100 mujtahids and other learned persons of the country into a national consultative assembly, and this assembly should have full authority to formulate laws that would initiate social progress." It was in this environment that combined increasing dissemination of Western democratic and liberal ideas, the calls for national and economic independence, and the growth of an educated, conscious middle class that the seeds of progressivism were sown. As a result, in 1906, the Shah, the Persian word for king, was forced to accept a new constitution that would hold the monarchy to greater account and decrease its capacity for absolutism. The degree of Western influence in the creation of the Constitution shines through in its verbatim adoption of some passages of the Belgian Constitution. In the words of one Iranian American scholar, it was essentially a, quote, religious declaration dressed in Western thought, unquote. In that vein, the Constitution still forbade any legislation that ran afoul of Sharia law, which indicated at the strength of the conservative clergy in the drafting process. Despite this, the period during and after the constitutional revolution of 1905 to 11 saw the first major women's movements take hold, setting the stage for a nascent progressivism scene in Iran. The first indication of conflicting values in Iranian society, where Western progressive thought melded with religious fundamentalism. Initially, Iranian feminists called for increased literacy rates for women, improving women's health and hygiene, and reducing the rate of young marriages, with their calls for the abolition of Sharia laws and for general equality being fairly limited. There were a few newspapers, poets and writers that promoted more radical reform. For example, one newspaper founded in 1919, Zabon-e Zanon, or Women's Voice in English, featured a prominent feminist writer by the name of Sedire Dolatabadi, who wrote articles criticizing the veil. Opinions such as these were met with incredible hostility. Her office at the newspaper she published for was almost subject to a mob attack, and her life was routinely threatened for the views she espoused. Despite this, increasing exposure and circulation to Western policies on the liberation of women and the travels of Iranian elites to Europe gradually pushed the idea of unveiling into the urban social consciousness and gave it a veneer of legitimacy. According to Hochang-i-Shahabi, an Iranian historian, the veil began to be associated with backwardness due to its prominence in more isolated and rural areas of Iran. Thus, opposition to the veil and Sharia law in general would remain an elite urban movement for much of the 1920s and early 1930s. Despite this, the Shah Reza, the king of Iran at the time, decided to implement a series of modernizing reforms that mandated the wearing of European dress for men. For example, suits and French-style headwear, as well as obligating the police to allow women to frequent public places unveiled. These laws were met with fervent opposition in tribal, rural areas of Iran. Even internally within the government, dissent was not unheard of, with even the Prime Minister Mehdi Qoli Hedayat, a zealous Muslim, refusing to wear a suit in place of traditional Iranian garb. But why would a Muslim country with a clear and significant opposition pursue such progressive laws? Well, Reza Shah's progressive reforms were heavily influenced by a state visit to Turkey in 1934. Under the leadership of its leader, Ataturk, Turkey had transitioned from a Muslim theocratic imperial state at the outset of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire to a secular nation in which women were no longer beholden to Sharia law. They partook in society, politics, and the economy and received an education. The progress it had made in these regards inspired the Shah to implement more wide-reaching reforms. Within 2 years, in 1936, Reza Shah would completely ban the wearing of veils by decree, thus implementing his progressive social and secular reforms via the vehicle of autocracy, a pattern that would intensify during the mid-1930s to create opposition to his rule. The Shah's tendency to implement deeply divisive reforms created an environment wherein religious moderates, who perhaps would have been open to the deregulation of women's appearances and the implementation of freedom of choice, were alienated. Now, of course, for many women, the Shah's reforms were a welcome unshackling. However, the way in which the reforms were enacted, unilaterally and without consent, caused many women who were still in favour of wearing the veil to become isolated and uncomfortable. Here we can see the origins of a theme in the Iranian socio-political landscape: the presence of an overbearing authority determining how society should operate, without participation of said society, thus creating stark lines of opposition. There would be no iterative evolution, no gradual departure from conservative Islamic thought. The fact that these laws were promulgated by force meant they weren't given the opportunity to mature or be shaped by competing interests. They were divisive immediately and could not be subject to compromise. As one Iranian political thinker put it, Iran was a, quote, short-term society, in which change was short, explosive, and often met with reactionary forces. This was, as he explains, a result of the lack of inviolable legal frameworks which could guarantee long-term continuity. It was a society that was constantly at the mercy of the whims of fashion, whether those be progressive or conservative. But why is this important for today's protests? Well, it not only shows the origins of progressivism in Iran, but also why it was often seen as a fad and never really found its footing in a democratic sense. Shah Reza was deposed in favour of his son in 1941, after unpopular secular reforms, his perception as a foreign puppet, and the despotism of his office exacerbated by an allied foreign invasion. The new Shah, his son Mohammad Reza, repealed his father's ban on the veil along with a raft of other reforms to placate traditionalists, as if to confirm the previous point of Iran's status as a short-term society. Following this, the practice of going unveiled became less popular because, as one Iranian scholar notes, the absence of a widespread socialization process to discard the wearing of the veil among women caused the law to wane. There was no educational process involved in the years of enforcement. This further reinforces the idea that, without institutions to reinforce change, volatility and a lack of continuity would dominate Iranian society. But this foray into progressivism still set a precedent for Iran, its women and their future, while other nations in the region never had the opportunity to test the waters. It also further reinforced that societal changes were top-down and undemocratic, causing resentment among the populace. A resentment that has been carried over into today's protests. While the new Shah would be less hardline and would retain his father's reforms on education for women and the right to go unveiled, even giving women the right to vote in 1962, the mid to latter portions of his rule would be mired with popularity issues which inadvertently caused some to abandon progressive ideals. The reason for this may not be what you expect, and it helps us further understand why, despite this, many in Iran still support those same ideals today. The path to revolution was in large part forged, ironically, by the Shah's attempts at rapid modernization. With the Shah's reforms came seismic changes in Iran's socio-economic makeup. Urban centres such as Tehran experienced incredible population influxes from rural areas. This was a result of opportunities drying up as the focus of the Shah's program shifted jobs from agriculture to industry, from low-skill to medium and high-skill labour. Inevitably, this drew individuals from areas with little prospect of development and education in these new forms of labour to the metropoles of Iran. Migration was also accompanied by rapid population growth, where the expansion of the population outstripped the number of positions being made available in the labour force, leading to a large, unemployed and rural segment of the population living at or under the poverty line. This, combined with the collapse in oil prices in the mid-1970s, caused investment in state-building projects to dry up and caused even well-educated and skilled Iranian labourers to be let go. In short, as the political scientist Theodor Skocpol put it in 1982, all urban strata could at this point blame the state for their troubles. Considering the Shah was essentially the state, the responsibility lay squarely at his feet. It also did not help that he frequently met protests that called for the devolution of power away from the Shah with incredible violence. He became a very unpopular, aloof despot ruling through coercion and co-option alone. So that is a brief overview of the demographic catastrophe that led in part to the Shah's fall. There is, however, an important byproduct of this situation: the conservatism imported from rural communities who previously had been isolated from the state's progressive and modernist streak. This intensified an already conservative urban environment where progressive reforms were mostly embraced by the economic elite. To make things worse, the Shah had failed to reform the Iranian educational system, as had his father, to accommodate these changes. They continued to, quote, reinforce traditional values and stereotypes, and were generally incompatible with what the Shah's top-down policies had promoted. Finally, as literacy rates were still fairly low among women, particularly rural ones, they often opposed measures intended to give them more freedom of choice. The reason being that they were less likely to question the clergy's position, as they had limited exposure to alternative sources of information and trusted implicitly the words of clergymen as the mouthpieces of God. The lack of institutional change involving a majority of the population doomed the reforms to be extremely contentious. It was in such an environment that the opposition to the Shah became one of traditionalism, of embracing Islamic values. It became a counter-cultural protest against the Shah's excess, corruption and secularism. Traditionalism was also given impetus by the Shah's economic and political ties to the West. The opponents of his regime believed that he was merely a projection of Western imperial forces and that they were, quote, behind all the doings of the modern arbitrary regime. Thus, his rule became heavily associated with Western corruption, meddling and plundering, and that further poisoned the waters of progressivism in the eyes of domestic political observers. For confirmation, one must only look at one of the most prominent anti-Western works written during Iran's shift to a more secular, progressive state, Westoxification. This popular book, written by a former clerical student turned Marxist in 1962, saw the intrusion of Western culture and ideals as perverting Islam, and thus Iranian identity. While not every Iranian took such an extreme view of Western influences, with some turning to Islam merely to protest the Shah's government, it still revealed the way in which Western progressive influences, particularly with respect to clothing, had been negatively politicized. In the words of Iranian writer Farzana Milani, a veilless woman became the personification of cultural imperialism. The veil basically became a symbol of opposition to the Shah and his regime, carried even by secularists and progressives. That is why some today still support progressivism, because society in the Shah's era didn't necessarily oppose it. They just opposed the Shah, who happened to represent it. With him gone, it no longer held such a negative connotation, and it is why after the revolution, many still wanted to retain much of the progressive system. The revolution against the Shah was composed of people from all walks of life and all political creeds. Everyone had a reason to be dissatisfied with him. It just so happened that Islamists were in a position to be the driving force behind the protests and subsequent revolution. As the Shah became more paranoid, potential opposition centres were quickly shut down. However, despite secular reforms, the Shah still had to tiptoe around directly opposing Shi'ism, as not to incense the powerful clergy class, from whom he derived some of his legitimacy. This meant the clergy could far more easily engage in dissent than a political party might have been able to. A network of 9,000 mosques and roughly 90,000 men represented an effective network to disseminate dissenting views and organise a resistance to the regime. Communists, liberals, nationalists, Islamists and moderates marched against the Shah for their own reasons. But the Ayatollah Khomeini, the most senior clergyman of the Islamic Shiite sect, was the primary architect of the revolution. He and the clergy moved the pieces. They controlled much of the communication lines and mechanisms of revolt. But, to retain the loyalty of his temporary allies, he initially made concessions. There were promises made to retain the liberal advancements made under the Shah for the significant proportion of those still in favour of them, as well as the establishment of a representative and democratic provisional government. Despite these assurances, the Ayatollah reneged on the promises merely months after the Shah had been ousted. Talk of full equality for women was replaced with the repeal of Shah-era laws that ensured women were legally equal to their husbands in marital disputes such as divorce, as well as the reintroduction of laws mandating the wearing of the hijab and restrictions on women's positions in Iran's court system. Additionally, By the end of 1979, a constitution had been drafted limiting party participation in Iranian democracy to those that conform to the, quote, criteria of Islam, which severely restricted freedom of expression. Clearly, however, that stipulation wasn't enough, and the provisional government, dominated by the clergy, went on to ban all opposition parties in the same year. Unsurprisingly, this was seen as a betrayal by many, whose association with Islamic revolutionary entities was purely due to a common enemy. The many non-Islamists that had been in favour of retaining elements of progressivism and liberalism were now subjected to Islamic fundamentalism. In that vein, one Christian bishop in Iran stated that, when the revolution came, we welcomed it. But it was not long before we found that we had exchanged one form of oppression for another even more severe. This is one of the reasons that Iran today has seen progressive movements more so than its neighbours, because those that supported progressivism were always there, even if they had been sidelined, oppressed, or co-opted by an unpopular monarch. Iran is a country of many contradictions, of reform and regression. It is a nation whose history of flirting with progressivism was not naturally occurring, imported by foreigners and adopted by domineering monarchs. It became an extremely contentious topic for Iranians, with connotations simultaneously of freedom and oppression. It may have represented liberation for women, but it also reflected the unilateral decisions of an absolutist political system that gradually became a universally despised institution. In this light, it is easy to understand how progressivism, the veil, women's rights and equality became politicized and used as pawns in political development. Progressivism never really settled in Iran as a result, but it did plant the seeds of what could be. A lesson for future generations that strive for freedom, a lesson clearly at the forefront of current protests. It is interesting that the rejection of progressivism was once used to signal disapproval of the Shah and his despotic regime, but today it is the embracing of progressivism that defines opposition to the theocratic regime of modern-day Iran. A society that flits from one fashion to the other, always at the mercy of unstable institutions and contradictory systems of political, cultural and religious thought. Understanding today's protests inevitably starts with understanding this fact, that Iran has struggled against authoritarianism for a long time, and has never really settled on what its people actually want from the state. The legacy of progressivism in Iran is a complicated one, but people have wanted it at least in some capacity for some time. Perhaps not forced onto them, but introduced in a democratic capacity at a pace conducive to a society of many differing opinions. In the past, choosing to don the hijab signified opposition to autocracy. Today, choosing to remove it signifies the same. It is the choice in the matter that is most important to Iranians, and women in particular.